Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about fermentation, which is what happens when glycolysis occurs and there's no oxygen around. It gets followed by fermentation. Fermentation is an anaerobic process, which remember we said means that there's no oxygen around. And what it does is it converts pyruvic acid into other organic compounds, like lactic acid or alcohol or carbon dioxide. It does not produce any ATP, but it is needed because that's the only way we get NAD+ back to keep glycolysis going. So if we didn't have fermentation, glycolysis would just stop because there'd be no more NAD+ to go pick up those electrons. So let's take a look at fermentation. Okay, there's two types, alcoholic and lactic acid fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation takes pyruvic acid, which if you remember was a 3-carbon product of glycolysis, turns it into ethyl alcohol, which is a 2-carbon, I can't make little circles, which is a 2-carbon molecule, and carbon dioxide, which is a 1-carbon molecule. So that turns into those. This occurs in yeast cells. Yeast are what we use to ferment things. It can be used to create different alcoholic beverages. It can also be used to bake bread. Okay, let's look at the steps. The first step of alcoholic fermentation is glycolysis, because we need to make the pyruvic acid. So this is just a very simplified version of glycolysis, what we learned. Glucose, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. ADP comes along, and some phosphates makes 2 ATP. Remember, that's the net total. The net total. And then what do I get is 2 3-carbon molecules of pyruvic acid. So the first thing that needs to happen is that. So here's my 2 ATPs, and here are my 2 NADHs that get formed when NAD+ comes along and picks up those electrons. Okay, next thing that's going to happen is since one glucose has 6 carbons in it, it makes 2 3-carbon pyruvic acids. So each of the 2 pyruvic acids that are produced by glycolysis, they're going to lose a carbon. So one of them from this guy and one of them from this guy, they're going to take off in the form of carbon dioxide. So they take 2 oxygens with them when they take off. And what that does is it forms this molecule called acetaldehyde. It's a 2-carbon molecule. So acetaldehyde, there's 1 carbon right there, and there's 1 carbon right there. Okay? So that's the second step. Take your pyruvic acid, and each one loses a carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, and that makes acetaldehyde. Okay, the next step is that 2 NADHs are going to come by with their hydrogens, and they're going to donate some of their hydrogens and electrons to the acetaldehyde, and that turns into ethanol. Ethanol is still a 2-carbon compound, but now this is the alcohol part of alcoholic fermentation. So there's the bubbles we get, which makes this bread rise and beer bubbly, and then this is the alcoholic portion right here. So what that does is when NADH comes and drops off the electrons, I have NAD+ again, which will now go back to glycolysis and do it all over again. So remember, he's the boat. Here's an empty boat, picks up things, full boat, dumps them off, empty boat, picks up things, full boat, dumps them off, and so on. Now the ethanol, you say, if ethanol is produced in alcoholic fermentation, why isn't bread, why isn't bread alcoholic? Well, when you cook the bread in the oven, all the alcohol burns off because of its low boiling point. And so then all you are left with is all the little bubbles or spaces in the bread where the carbon dioxide was. Okay, now lactic acid fermentation is slightly different. It doesn't release any CO2, any bubbles. So what we do with this one is we turn our pyruvic acid into lactic acid, or lactate. This occurs in many bacteria and also our muscle cells under high stress. So here is a spoon of yogurt, and if we were to look very carefully inside, we would find all sorts of little bacteria floating around in there. But it's okay, they're good bacteria. We want them there. Okay, for lactic acid fermentation, it begins the same way. Glucose goes through the process of glycolysis to make pyruvic acid, which is a 3-carbon molecule. My pen does not want to communicate well with the computer, so it doesn't make nice little circles. And in the process, we make ATP and NADH. Okay, the next step is, quite simply, the pyruvic acid, which has 3 carbons, 2, 3, is going to be swooped upon by NADH, and he's going to dump off his protons and electrons, and that turns it into lactic acid, which is still a 3-carbon molecule. But now, because he's got those extra hydrogens and electrons, he's now different than pyruvic acid. And so that's where my lactic acid comes from. Done. That's it. Real simple. Okay. So go back over those again. Make sure you got the idea. We'll practice them again in class. And the next thing we're going to look at is aerobic respiration, which is what happens when glycolysis occurs and there is oxygen around. Then it gets a little complicated. Those two were easy. It gets complicated next. Okay, bye-bye.